Ryan is a principal economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and focuses on entrepreneurship, firm dynamics, and macroeconomics in both official and non-traditional private data. With John Halterwanger, he's got some really great new insights into the startup surge during the pandemic era, which we can spend some time addressing. And he just has a really creative body of work on the dynamics of boomtowns, high-tech business growth during COVID, what decline in dynamism looks like, and a lot more of related topics. So I'm going to welcome Ryan out here. It'll take just a few minutes to queue up his presentation, and then we'll get going with his presentation. Thanks.
That's a tough act to follow, especially since I am from the government. I'm not here to help, though. I'm just here to talk a little bit. My name's Ryan Decker. I'm an economist at the Fed board in DC. And today I'm going to be presenting some joint work I've done with John Halterwanger at the University of Maryland. And it's a couple of different papers, one that's been circulating for a bit that is being published by Brookings, and then a more recent note just a few weeks old on high-tech stuff. I do have to emphasize a disclaimer, which is that I'm on the staff at the Fed. However, nothing I say today represents the view of the Federal Reserve Board, staff, or system. And that goes for my talk, for Q&A, for any conversations. I'm just here representing myself. So I'm going to start with a chart. Some folks may have seen this. This is a chart showing applications for new businesses. They're called business applications by people. This comes from a Census Bureau product called the Business Formation Statistics. They get data from the IRS on applications for new employer identification numbers. So if you're going to start a business, if you'll be a corporation, or if you're going to be a partnership where you're going to be hiring workers, you'll probably need an EIN from the IRS. Even some sole proprietorships get EINs for various reasons. The IRS gets these data, they ship them over to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau takes the whole data set, they throw out non-businesses like trusts and estates and so on, and then they keep everything else. And they report these applications. Now, importantly, this is a sort of aspirational thing, right? These businesses might not actually do anything at all, but they are people who've applied for EINs. The black line there shows total applications. Those are monthly data, and so that's everything that the Census Bureau is putting together. The green line shows what we'll call likely employer applications, and so these are applications that the Census Bureau has looked at their characteristics. It's a subset of the total series that have one or more characteristics that tend to be predictive of actual employer business creation. So it might be industry or legal form of organization, intention to hire employees, things like that. That's the green line, the likely employer series. Importantly, this is not like a model-based prediction of business entry. I'm going to show some of that later, but it is a subset of the applications that tends to move closely with actual firm entry. So there's some very striking patterns here, and I think very surprising if you think back to how you felt in March or April of 2020. Did you expect that there would be a historic surge in business entry or really anything good at all? And that's actually what we got. So there was an initial dip in these applications, and then they surged to the highest pace on record. The sharp point that you see there in 2020 is July of 2020. They sort of eased down throughout the rest of the year. So there was this first wave that sort of eased off. And then in 2021, all of these series picked up again and have remained quite elevated even into the most recent data, which are for March of this year, just a couple months ago. The April data will be out next week. A striking thing about this is that the likely employer series moved closely with what I'm calling likely non-employers. That's just the difference between the total and the likely employers. This is kind of surprising because in the past this hasn't so much been the case. You could probably think of reasons that what we'll call non-employer entrepreneurship, self-employment where I'm just kind of doing my own thing, I'm not hiring anybody. You can think of reasons why that might actually move up in a weak economic environment. If the labor market's really bad and people are just looking for income, they might try out self-employment. And indeed, in the prior recession, the Great Recession, we actually did see a move up in non-employer entrepreneurship. But the big surprise is the likely employer series because employer entrepreneurship tends to plummet during recessions, and it did plummet in the prior recession. But here we have it moving closely with the likely employers, with the likely non-employers. So this was a big surprise. It led to a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to answer, or at least partially answer some of these today. The first question was basically, are these applications serious? Does this really mean anything? And early on, I think there was a lot of skepticism, including me. I was a little bit worried, well, it's not that hard to apply for an EIN. Some of you have laptops. You could probably get it filled out before I quit talking. It's very easy. A low-cost thing like that, people are work from home or they're temporarily laid off in the summer of 2020. They got nothing to do. and they go and file these, and maybe they don't really mean anything. And that was a common view, and the concern was, will we get the kind of actual employer business creation that we know historically is very, very important for job creation and productivity and things like that. Historically, these application series have done a great job of predicting actual employer entry, but for the reasons I just said, you might think the pandemic surge could be different. So that's one question. The next question is basically, what's the story here? Even if we do get these entrants, what happened? Why did this happen? And I don't have super rigorous causal analysis for you today. It's going to take some time for people to really pin down, was there a policy thing? What was there? But what I'm going to do today is just sort of say, we can tell pandemic stories with these data. We can make sense of these data in light of what happened in the pandemic in terms of geographic patterns and in terms of industry patterns. And by looking at those patterns and comparing them to other things we know about the pandemic, we can kind of make sense of it. And what I'll argue is this actually makes sense given other things we know about the pandemic. Another question I'll touch on is about productivity. Historically, business entry is important for productivity because of new ideas and how those ideas spread and accumulate productive resources. But could this time be different? Maybe these are lifestyle entrepreneurs who don't have an idea, they're just sort of wanting a change of pace. And if that's the case, then we might not expect to get the kind of productivity boost from this entry surge that we've gotten from entry surges in the past. And then finally, I'll try to talk a little bit about longer run trends. My co-author and I and others have done a lot of research in pre-pandemic trends in business entry, and I'll put us in that context. So let me start by kind of knocking out this first question about, did we get actual employer business creation to follow these EIN applications? And the answer is yes. This is a busy chart, but I can walk you through it. The green line on the chart is that same likely employer application series I just showed you. The orange line is a measure of employer establishment births quarterly, okay? These are actual business locations with actual formal employees, W-2 employees, okay? Now, there's a bit of technical jargon I have to give you to understand the talk, which is that an establishment, that word has a very precise meaning in US statistical agencies. An establishment is any operating location of an employee, of an employer business, okay? What does that mean? It means that an establishment birth could be a brand new firm, a new company starting up and hiring people, or alternatively, it could be a new Starbucks location. Okay, and obviously that distinction is important, but we get those data at a quarterly frequency and they're very timely. What happened is establishment births picked up starting in the second quarter of 2021, and they've remained very high. You can see they've been coming back down again, but all the way from the second quarter of 2021 through the most recent data in the third quarter of last year, new establishment births were creating 1 million jobs per quarter. That's an enormous number, and it's probably played a large role in labor market stories. But as I said, this could be new locations for Starbucks, and that would have very different implications than new firms. We do have data on firm births, though. They're a little bit more lagged. They're annual, but that's the black line. These are annual firm births. There's another little subtle technical point here, which is that the annual data, they end in March. So it's like the 12 months leading up to March of a given year. So that first jump in the black line that you see, that means that in the 12 months leading up to March of 2022, we saw this big jump in actual firm births. Okay, so not just new Starbucks locations, these are new firms. They jumped in 2022. They moved down a little bit in 2023, but stayed pretty elevated. So it seems like we did get a genuine surge in firm entry, and these firm entrants created nearly 2 million jobs per year for the last couple of years. That's the highest pace of job creation from new firms since before the Great Recession, since like 2007. So this is a pretty remarkable story. Now let me talk about some pandemic themes, and I'm gonna start with geography. And what I'm gonna do is try to convince you that actually this surge makes sense. Now, I'm an economist, and we're often good at explaining things after the fact. We didn't see it coming, and that's what I'm gonna do today. So I'm just gonna take advantage of the hindsight. What I'm showing here is by state, the surge in business applications. So I look at the pandemic pace of business applications and compare it to the pre-pandemic pace by state. And I do it on a per capita basis, so we're not just picking up population flows. And I say, what are the states that saw the biggest increase in applications during the pandemic relative to pre-pandemic times? And there's some patterns here that might be familiar to you. Huge movement towards the South, the Sun Belt, and the West. And there's lots of other economic stories that have gone that way during the pandemic. Lots of movement of economic activity out of the Northeast and into the Sun Belt. And there's some great research by other folks on that I mentioned here. There's also an interesting geography story within cities. So this chart, this map on the right is showing you the counties of New York City, okay? And I'm doing the same thing, it's just at the county level instead of the state level. The darker blue is the bigger surge. And what you see, if you can see Manhattan, the little white county in the middle there, saw very little surge in business applications at all. Now that's a break from the norm. Prior to the pandemic, Manhattan tended to have a pretty high entry rate. But in the pandemic, we saw very little in Manhattan. We saw much more in outer suburbs. And we've done a little bit more general statistical analysis and found that this is generally the case. In large cities, what we see is very low increase in applications in the city centers, much higher around the suburbs. We find that it's tightly correlated with work from home. So what's happening there? Well, probably gyms are opening up by your house because you're working from home now. Restaurants opening up by your house. That could be one way to explain this. Now that's also very familiar. I think everybody sort of knows what's happened to downtown areas, especially major cities, more in some parts of the country than in others. But this movement from downtown areas to the surrounding counties is consistent with other pandemic stories that we've heard. Now this is for applications, those EIN applications. It turns out we see the same thing in the actual establishment entry. I can go down to the county level. I can't see firm entry at the county level yet. We're waiting on data. But I can see net establishment entry at the county level. So I can look at all the counties of the US. And what I'm doing with this chart on the left here, it's a simple scatter plot. The horizontal axis is the surge in applications at the county level, so pandemic versus pre-pandemic pace. And the vertical axis is the surge in net establishment entry at the county level. So we're asking, did the counties that saw a big surge in applications also get a big surge in actual employer establishment entry? And the answer is yes, we get a very positive, strong correlation here between these. It happened in the same place. I've got New York City on the right there. Similar story, it doesn't look exactly the same, but in general we find that the actual employer establishment entry followed a similar pattern within cities. Let me switch to geography, if the button will click. Switch to industry. Let's talk about industry. So there's been some big industry stories in the pandemic. What I'm doing here is I'm going to a relatively narrow level of industry detail. For those who know, this is 3-digit NAICS codes. I'm looking at the top industries in terms of the application surge. Where did we get the application surge from? What industries gave it to us? And I've identified the top 5 of these. And there's some big pandemic stories here. The biggest one you see is the blue line. That's non-store retail. That includes online retail. Huge surge in applications in online retail. Now there's a big blip in 2023. We think that's spurious. There were some changes to reporting requirements for marketplace third-party sellers. I'll show some other stuff to sort of show that. But if you kind of ignore that blip at the end, you see this initial huge surge in non-store retail, probably an online retail story, right? It has kind of eased off throughout the pandemic. The red line is professional, scientific, and technical services. This is a very big sector. It has a lot of stuff. It has home appraisers, it has architects. It also has a lot of important high-tech stuff. Indeed, some of the high-tech stuff that in survey data has been associated with AI activities within firms. So computer systems design, research and development services, those are in that red line there. And it's had a pretty solid surge, and if anything, has picked up over the last year or two, and I'm gonna come back to that sector a couple more times. Personal and laundry includes pet care. I don't know what's going on here, but like everybody bought a dog in 2020, and maybe some of that is showing up here. There's some other things, and I'll skip to truck transportation. So this includes even last mile stuff. You can make sense of this, right? Initially, people were all having things delivered to their houses. That required a lot more delivery vehicles. You can see it kind of rise in 2021, and 2022, which is when we had tremendous supply chain challenges in the United States, including in freight markets and including in trucking markets. So these are industries that are conducive to pandemic work, lifestyle, and business. And it kind of makes sense. I have another application-based series to show you. This is using an actual predictive model. So the Census Bureau, they get these applications and they build a model internally that looks at all the characteristics of the application and predicts whether they'll turn into a true employer firm birth. Census has the data on both sides of this transition, and so they can do this. This kind of cleans out some of the noise And in fact, I'm showing retail trade here. This is done at the broad sector level, but I'm showing retail trade here, and indeed, that little jump I told you about in 2023, it doesn't show up. The predictive model was not fooled. So this is just a useful thing to look at. But you see a similar story here, and again, I would just highlight the professional, scientific, and technical services line, the red line there, which has been picking up recently, which I think might be important. Okay, that's still an application-based series. It's predictive of employer entry, but it's application-based. Here's some employer entry information. Again, I'm going to compare actual employer entry to the application surge. I've got a scatter plot. This is at the broad sector level. So I look at the surge in applications on the horizontal axis of this scatter plot, and then I look at the surge in this case, because I can do it at the sector level here, I look at the surge in firm births, actual employer firm births, the thing we really want to see. Now, I've drawn a 45-degree line here. These are growth rates. I did it in logs, but that means it's growth rates, basically. If you're a sector that lands right on that 45-degree line, that means you saw the same surge in applications and in births, firm births, okay? So we saw the same thing in both. And you can see quite a few sectors are on the line. So it does turn out that in general, sectors that saw a big surge in applications did see a surge in firm births. There's a couple of noteworthy exceptions here. Retail is the most glaring one. The surge in applications in the retail sector was much larger than what we've seen in the actual employer data. There's also an exception on the other side, which is the information sector. This is a tech-intensive sector. It includes things like software publishing, data hosting. That's information. Very interestingly, we saw a bigger increase in actual firm births than we did in applications. Might suggest that the transition rates in that industry were very, very high, transition from application to employer. Now, we can run this a bunch of different ways. We can do it with establishment births. We can do it at narrower levels of industry detail. And in general, we see this. Industries with a lot of applications saw a lot of employer entry. Okay, now let me just segue into the role of high tech. There is a long research literature in economics, and you don't even need that really to tell you because there's all this history, suggesting that business entry, among other sources of dynamism, is historically important for aggregate productivity. And indeed, the last big productivity boom that we had in this country, which was in the late 90s through early 2000s, has been found to be closely associated with high-tech using and producing sectors that had seen an earlier surge in business entry. So the hope would be that this pandemic surge in entry that we've been observing and talking about is going to lead to stronger productivity growth in the United States going forward. That would be the hope. But you might think of reasons to be skeptical of that. One way to think about some of what I've just shown you is that it's a simple restructuring. If we move the restaurants and gyms from the downtown area to the suburbs, the effects on aggregate economy-wide productivity are not likely to be very substantial. It's great, it's good for those entrepreneurs, it's good for the people who want to work from home and have those businesses close by, but it's probably not going to drive aggregate productivity and GDP a whole lot higher than otherwise. And I just showed you some evidence that that's part of what this story is. So maybe there's not a productivity story here. But an alternative theory would be that there could be a burst of innovation. And to look into this a little bit, and this is a bit preliminary, I'm going to look at the industry composition of the surge in employer establishment entry. And I'm going to go down into narrower industry detail where we can think about how high-tech intensive is a specific narrow industry and what kind of establishment entry patterns did we see there. So in this chart, I'm showing annual net establishment gains in growth rates, basically. So you could think about the axis as being like percentage points. I've normalized it to 2019, so 2019 is 0, and you can see this surge relative to the pace that we were seeing prior to the pandemic. I've divided these narrow industries into high-tech or non-tech using methods from the research. In this case, we're looking at how STEM-intensive is the employment of this industry, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. So is this an industry that employs a lot of sort of high-tech type people? If it is, we'll call them tech. We can do this using various approaches to that, and we get similar results. But as you can see, these industries I've categorized as high-tech saw an enormous increase in establishment creation, net establishment creation during the pandemic. In 2022, the growth rate in the number of establishments was about 8 percentage points higher than the pre-pandemic norm. That's what that axis is telling us. And the pre-pandemic norm for high-tech was something like 4% a year. And so it is actually quite a striking thing. Now, if I had shown you this chart without the tech line and only showed the blue line, the non-tech industries, you would have found that pretty striking too. In fact, we saw a big increase in establishment formation in non-tech industries as well. But it's just dwarfed by what's going on in the red line here. So there does seem to be something here. We've pushed on this question in a bunch of different ways and found it to be a pretty robust result. And I can show you some of these industries. So what I did is I made a list of the top 20 narrow industries in terms of the number of establishments that they gained during this pandemic period or since the pandemic started, okay? So I make a list of the top 20 narrow industries, 4-digit NAICS for those who use NAICS codes. And I say, how many of these are tech? Now, tech is actually a small share of the economy. Depending how you define it, it's like 5 to 15% of the economy. And I wanted to see, well, is it overrepresented among the top 20 industries? And indeed it is. So here I looked at the top 20 industries. It's hard to put them all on a slide. We have it in our note online, but I just grabbed the tech ones, the ones that are counting as tech with some definitions I'm using. And you can see pretty interesting industries here. Computer systems design and related services. You could imagine lots of reasons you might need things like that, not only to help companies transition to work from home, but also these AI type stories that have been coming require an enormous amount of computer system design. There's a technical consulting thing here. Software publishers. So we see a lot of really techie industries. Research and development services is a very important industry that serves largely businesses. And we see this big increase. Now, importantly, another little bit of technical material here is that industry codes are set at the establishment level. If I'm Walmart, I'm a retailer, but if I open a data center somewhere, it'll show up in the appropriate industry, in a data center type industry. And so these scientific research and development services, they could be a lot of things. They could be attached to incumbent firms. I'm looking at establishment birth here. As I mentioned, that could be incumbent firms or new firms. But these are some striking numbers. Computer systems design added 120,000 establishments since the pandemic started. That's enormous. The total increase in establishments is about 1.7 million, and 120,000 of them coming from that one little industry. Now, you might say this is a little unfair to the tiny industries. If you're a small but important industry, you can't add that many establishments and get high in this ranking. So I'll do it in another way and just look at the industry level growth rate in the number of establishments. And we get a similar list here. That's this one here. And it gets reordered a little bit. Scientific R&D actually comes a little higher. It's the 6th highest industry in terms of its within-industry growth. Software publishers basically doubled. The number of establishments in that industry basically doubled during the pandemic. This 97 log points, it's actually more than doubled. So I think there's some interesting industries here. When I do it this way, you even see some manufacturing. Obviously, there's some very important high-tech activity in the manufacturing sector, and we're seeing that here. So there does seem to be a tech story. One question that I've sort of hinted at is, okay, are these new establishments in the tech sector? Are these new establishments being opened by existing firms or are they entrepreneurs? And in some ways, these could have similar effects. In other ways, they might be different, so we might care about the distinction. We don't have the data yet. Eventually, these data come out. We can't quite nail this exactly, but I can get kind of close. So first, at the broad sector level, I can look at establishment births and I can, in fact, separate them between incumbent firms. So if Walmart opens a data center, that's an incumbent firm establishment birth. And I can separate out the genuine new firms. I can only do this at the broad sector level. Maybe you're getting a taste. When you study this stuff, there's always these trade-offs with data. But I can do this at the broad sector level and I can actually separate them. I'm gonna do it in terms of growth relative to pre-pandemic like I've been doing. And on the horizontal axis there, I'm looking at the growth in establishment births coming from new firms. And then on the vertical axis, I'm doing it for incumbent firms. And again, I've stuck a 45-degree line in there. What does the 45-degree line mean? If you're on that line, you're a sector that saw the same increase in establishment births from both new firms and incumbents. You kind of got both, okay? If you're above the 45-degree line, incumbents played a larger role. And you can see there's some sectors here that are above the line, and in particular, in green, I'm circling some that are particularly tech intensive, the information sector, professional and business services, and manufacturing. These all have relatively high STEM shares. In fact, I think these are the top 3 industries, depending what year you measure it. So these each actually saw a bigger surge in establishment births from incumbent firms than from new firms. I would emphasize, though, that a couple of these did get a big increase from new firms. Right? So if you look at the information sector, it's pretty well along that horizontal axis, same with professional and business, not so much for manufacturing. So it seems like there's both new firms and incumbent firms participating in this tech establishment entry story, maybe more on the incumbent side than new firms. But there's one other thing to show here, which is if we think back to that application data I was showing you, and I told you how the Census Bureau has this internal modeling where they predict actual firm births. These predictions tend to be pretty good using the application data. I've got them here for these 3 big tech sectors, predicted firm births from the application data. And you see some interesting things, actually. It looks like early on, there was a lot of predicted births in manufacturing. It's kind of eased off. But their professional, scientific, and technical services is still very high and indeed has picked up recently. And again, this is a really important sector. It has a lot of important high-tech stuff, including research and development, including computer systems design, and things like that. So there's probably a little bit of both, and we'll learn much more as we get more data. Okay, I'll shift gears here and talk about one more pandemic item, and then I'll turn to longer run trends. You might have heard this term, I think journalists invented it, the Great Resignation. During the pandemic, and the years kind of following the pandemic, we saw an incredible increase in the share of workers quitting their jobs in a given month. So people called it the Great Resignation. This is before quiet quitting or whatever the latest thing is. The Great Resignation was an earlier thing. And I have, again, a busy chart here, but I'll walk you through this. This kind of shows it. The purple line there, it's a purple dotted line, shows the quit rate. That's the monthly share of workers who quit their jobs. And if you look at the pandemic period, you can see what people are talking about with the Great Resignation. So in 2021 and 2022, this was very, very elevated. It's actually returned back to pre-pandemic norms now. I've also shown you in the green line that likely employer application series, clear from the very beginning. And in the orange line is the establishment birth series. You can see that establishment births and quits, they move along closely. And you could probably think of theories for why this might be, right? People would quit their jobs and flow to these new establishments, either as early workers or as potentially as firm founders. But it's also the case that there are a lot of macroeconomic time series that behave similarly through the pandemic. It was an extreme event. You wouldn't want to draw too many conclusions by just looking at these lines. So what I want to do is I want to go down to fine geographic detail. And I can't do that in the quits data. They're not available at like county level, but I can with a proxy. So I'm going to use a proxy that we call excess separations. Total separations would be, we look at all the workers that separated from their firm in a given period, say a quarter. Okay, those are separations. People separate from their firm for a number of reasons. We're going to do excess separations by subtracting off what's called job destruction. If you leave the firm and your job is never refilled, the firm's head count goes down, that's job destruction. If that happens, a reasonable theory for why you left the firm is that you were laid off. The firm actually got smaller. If you leave the firm and you're immediately replaced by someone else, the firm doesn't destroy the job, then that's often a quit. Now, you could have gotten fired. Quits are much more common than getting fired. So excess separations historically in economic research has been used as sort of a proxy for quits. It's the separations in which you got replaced. They move closely with what's called job-to-job separations. That's this blue line here. That's where we can actually follow the worker and they immediately went to another job. Again, probably a quit. I'm going to use excess separations as a proxy for quits because I can do it at the county level. And what I want to see is this seeming relationship between business entry and quits in the pandemic. Does it hold up across geography, or is it just sort of a spurious time series aggregation issue? Okay, so this scatter plot is using county level data. Once again, on the horizontal axis, I've put business applications per capita. It's the surge in business applications relative to pre-pandemic. I can do this for other measures like establishment entry and so on. We get a pretty similar result. The vertical axis is the surge in quits, my proxy for quits, excess separations. And what do we see? The counties that had a lot of business applications also had a lot of quits. The Great Resignation, to some extent, happened in the same counties that this business entry surge happened. So it lends a little bit of support to the theory that people were quitting their jobs and flowing to these businesses. I could also do this for layoffs, because one theory of the surge in entry, I touched on it earlier, is, well, if the labor market gets really bad, people kind of have no choice but to turn to self-employment. And we know in 2020, there was an enormous historical pace of layoffs. The labor market was very bad for a time. Could that explain the business entry surge that we got? And it doesn't seem to. So if I make this same scatter plot using layoffs or job destruction, we get a very, very weak relationship. Depending how I specify it, it's negative, it's zero, slightly positive, but nothing like what we're seeing here. That doesn't seem to be the story. And also, if you think about layoffs, we did have very high layoffs in 2020, even parts of 2021, but actually the layoff pace in aggregate has been very subdued for the last couple of years now. There's some pockets of industries, but the idea that layoffs is causing the surge in entry isn't consistent with the fact that layoffs came back down way earlier than the entry surge did. So that doesn't seem to be it, although there could be something here. If this is the case, then it seems like the Great Resignation is partly related to this business surge in entry and this enormous churning of workers that we've seen over the last 3 years. Entry seemed to have played some role. Okay, let me now turn to some pre-pandemic trends. What was happening before? Part of what's made this surge so remarkable and surprising is that prior to the pandemic, there had been a multi-decade decline in rates of business entry in the United States. Now, I'm showing this here in a couple of ways. There's a long literature on this. We have a couple of different data sources we can look at. Some are more timely, some have a longer time series. It's the game we're in. You can see on the left, if I just create an entry rate that is the number of new firms divided by the total number of firms. Okay, new firms as a share of all firms. Long run decline. It goes up and down as it's come down, but that's been the story for a while now. On the right panel, I show it as a share of employment. Jobs created by new firms as a share of all the jobs in the economy. That's also been declining, as you can see. These are some pretty large declines. So this has been called in the economics literature the secular decline in business dynamism. And there's a huge literature. I have a paper with my current co-author and others dating 10 years ago now, 2014, in which we sort of documented a lot of these trends. It's not just declining entry rates, but other measures of dynamism as well. Job reallocation, the pace at which jobs are reallocated across the economy. Businesses shrink and grow, and jobs flow between them. The pace of job reallocation had been declining over this same time period. The pace of worker reallocation, so quits and hires, and the rate at which workers are switching jobs have been declining. Even rates of internal migration in the United States have been declining. There had been a trend of weaker productivity selection. What do we mean by that? Well, a very important element of a market economy is that productive businesses need to grow. They have the good ideas. We need to give them the workers and the capital. And unproductive businesses shrink or exit. That's actually been an important contributor to aggregate productivity growth in the past. That productivity selection, where the higher productivity ones are the more likely to grow, has weakened over time prior to the pandemic. It had been weakening. It was still there. It was still a positive relationship if you go measure this stuff at the firm or establishment level, but it had been slowing down. We had seen rising average firm size and concentration. That's a good thing or a bad thing depending on your views, but it had been associated with these dynamism stories. And this could have big implications for aggregate job creation. For productivity growth, there's a little bit of evidence that some of the productivity growth slowdown we saw after about 2004 might have been related to this stuff. It can even matter for business cycles. So this was a large literature, and it was occupying an enormous amount of time. And you know, like anything else, I don't think we've nailed what exactly caused it. There's various theories that were proposed in the literature. One had to do with demographics. So it turns out that historically, and even in standard models in economic theory, labor force growth is absorbed by entrance. And without labor force growth, it's hard for businesses to enter. We did see a slowing in labor force growth in the United States. That might be part of the story. There's stories about regulatory and business policy environment. You know, we would say things like a tax on firing is a tax on hiring. So there's some evidence that unlawful discharge regulations and the like may have slowed this stuff down. There could be stories that are sort of benign about the change in business model. So we wrote a paper in which we argued that part of the decline was concentrated in the retail trade sector, where we saw the rise of big box retail. Big box retail, it turns out, is enormously productive, much more productive than the businesses that they replaced, and they pay better wages and other things. So there could be parts of this story that are sort of fine, but that didn't explain all of it, and there's other stories. A very popular thing to talk about recently is rising market power and the idea that the US economy is becoming monopolized. So folks have gone out and tried to calculate measures of market power and argue that it's related to declining entry. I'm pretty skeptical. I have a recent paper with a note with Brian Albrecht in which we look at industries and don't really see it, but this is a popular story that will continue being discussed. There's stories about knowledge investment, the increasing importance of knowledge-based capital as opposed to physical capital in the productive process, and whether that creates difficulties for new firms or perhaps diffusion of ideas slows. And then there's been some debates about the exact nature of the decline. So this has been going on for a while, and I guess the question is, does this pandemic surge is that all over now? And are we reversing the trend? And I mean, obviously it's too early to tell. I showed you the chart. In the blue line, you're able to see the last couple years of firm entry rates. You can see those are pretty striking jumps relative to what we've been seeing, but they don't get us anywhere near to where we were in the 90s or the 80s in terms of firm entry rates. So that's the first issue, is that this is just sort of a small thing. Additionally, I haven't shown it here, but in some of our papers we show these entrants that we've gotten during the pandemic have been a little smaller than entrants prior to the pandemic. Sometimes that might suggest that these businesses are going to have a lower survival rate or might not have quite the quality that entrants had in the past. I didn't show you the chart, but I could show you job reallocation. That's another one of these dynamism stories. It's similar to entry in that there was a big jump in job reallocation. It doesn't get us anywhere near to where we were in the 90s. And just more generally, to get a durable reversal of the pre-pandemic trend, we need not just a couple of years of higher entry, but we need continued surging entry. And most importantly, we need those recent entries to grow. They need to innovate and they need to grow and they need to survive. So it's sort of too early to tell. But I think it's worth keeping in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is these stories that I've told for theories that people have for why there was a pre-pandemic decline. Pick your theories and decide which ones you believe, and then ask, is that still true now? If the demographic headwinds are still there, if the business and policy environment hasn't changed, and all of these things, you probably wouldn't expect the trend to suddenly reverse and bring us back to where we were decades ago. So I think we'll still have to think about these longer run stories. So I'll wrap up and then we could do questions or whatever. So what happened in the pandemic? This is a remarkable story. Nobody expected it. There's probably somebody who expected it, but at the very beginning of the pandemic, those applications dipped for a time, for a couple of months. There was an article in Forbes about this. There were lots of people who were saying there's gonna be a complete collapse of business entry because of the pandemic. And that's going to have knock-on effects for labor markets for years to come, and so on. So there was a lot of concern for those first couple months, and then we had this enormous reversal. It's quite a story. What happened? Well, entrepreneurs did what entrepreneurs do. They saw opportunities and they went after them. There were huge changes to patterns of consumption, to patterns of work and lifestyle and what people are doing, to patterns of business and what businesses needed. A lot of businesses found themselves needing more IT infrastructure so that they could have people work from home or so that they could do online retail. These were opportunities, and entrepreneurs did what they do, which is go after these opportunities. It's an incredible story, and I think it's a testament to, despite these longer run trends, American dynamism is really something to behold. And indeed, the best we can tell in cross-country comparisons, other countries haven't seen this. They've seen some rise, some countries have seen some, but nobody's seen what we've seen here. It's a remarkable story. And we really just shouldn't count out the American entrepreneur, I think. That was a mistake from the time. The entry surge seems to have facilitated or followed, I don't want to make a strong causal statement, the broader pandemic economic restructuring across geography and industry, and indeed it might be an important ingredient of the remarkable labor market recovery that we saw after the pandemic and some of these other reallocations that had to happen. We do have this evidence that high-tech industries saw a large and disproportionate entry surge. Some of that might be early pandemic stories about online retail and work from home, but it increasingly looks, over the last couple of years, that it could be related to other stories around big IT investments for things like AI and so on. And then it seems likely or possible, at least, that many quitters float to the new businesses. So we've seen some shifts in the industry and geography pattern of economic activity. We have a slightly younger firm age distribution. First time in a long time that's happened. A little bit more activity at small firms, and a pause in pre-pandemic trends. Anyways, so I'll stop there and we can take any questions. One of the theories I didn't mention that people had for why is there this surge was basically PPP fraud. So there was a theory that people somehow were finding ways, PPP was supposed to be designed for existing businesses. You had to have pre-existing revenue, but there was a theory, well, if you filed some fraudulent paperwork, you could get PPP money. A couple of reasons to be skeptical of that theory. Number one, and we talk about this in the paper, the Census Bureau, they have the PPP microdata, they have the individual loans, and they can link them up to their huge database of firms. And so they had looked at this directly, and they didn't find that, that new EINs were getting PPP money. The other reason to be a little skeptical, I feel like that theory was much stronger in 2020, in 2021. It's hard to explain 2023 with the PPP money ran out a long time ago. The third thing about PPP is, if anything, it's a subsidy to incumbent firms. And we would generally think that a subsidy to incumbents would actually deter entry. So if anything, this kind of happened in spite of PPP. As for the general programs, there was an enormous amount of demand stimulus coming from every angle. And theory would suggest that business entrants are an important margin by which the economy responds to demand shocks and other types of aggregate shocks. Having a lot of demand out there sloshing around is probably a good thing if you're trying to start a business. So it's easy to imagine. And indeed, there's some research by Catherine Fazio and Scott Stern and Jorge Guzman from 2020 where they have weekly data on business registrations that's very similar to the applications. And they do find sort of jumps in registrations at the times that checks went out. So there's a little bit of evidence that those policies could have mattered. I mean, sorting out all the different policies and trying to pin down sort of causal relationship, it's going to be really, really hard. But, you know, there might be something there.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about the international comparisons. I mean, with countries like Canada, Britain, France.
Yeah, you caught me off guard because I don't remember the countries. People have tried to look at this, though, and there's a couple of countries where there was a decent surge. I think Germany was one, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries. I don't think Canada had a particularly strong surge, the UK. So I should have done some homework on that, but we're just way off the charts relative to everyone else.
So here in your wrapping up slide, it says high-tech industries saw a large disproportionate entry surge. But anecdotally, I have heard of many people being laid off multiple times within the same year in these high-tech companies. So would you say that there's a large disproportionate layoff pattern in this industry as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it is true that there have been a lot of tech layoffs over the last few years. And I think that shows up a bit in the sector level layoff data. It's also, you know, it's possible. My data the data I showed for tech go through March of 2023. That should pick up those earlier tech layoffs, but things that have happened since March of 2023, I'm not picking that up. Now, we did find, there was a way to sort of roll it forward a couple quarters and we found similar results, but a lot could have happened since 2023. And if you remember that chart, the big peak in tech and in several of these measures was 2022. It came down some then. It's possible that it's trending down. So I think it's hard to say. It seems like the tech sector is undergoing a lot of reallocation right now, where some areas of the tech sector are having high layoffs, and meanwhile, there's a lot going on in terms of investment in computing hardware and stuff. So it's a really good question, maybe a little too early to tell how it relates to this specifically.
What are the implications of your findings? So looking at those top results, what do you think it means for our country, I'll just leave it kind of broad in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's, first of all, as I said, I think it's encouraging that despite these longer run trends, these headwinds that we've seemingly been seeing, that this happened. I think that's a remarkable reason for optimism, that when the opportunities came, American entrepreneurs just went after it, and it would appear created a ton of jobs and maybe other benefits. So that makes me optimistic. I also think that the evidence on high tech specifically is encouraging. It is very early. Historically, it takes quite a while for a surge in entry, even in high tech, to sort of move the needle on aggregate statistics. Productivity, GDP, people's income generally. That takes a lot of time. Some folks have talked about, you know, if you watch the news, measured productivity growth last year was really, really high. I saw people writing, oh, it might be because of the entrepreneurship boom. I really doubt it because it takes a lot longer than that. And so that's a reason for optimism. If these tech businesses we've seen survive, if they're not all doing layoffs like we just talked about, that would be a reason for a positive outlook for aggregate productivity growth some years in the future, maybe 5 years or 7 years, it depends on how people measure it. And that could be a really good thing because we have had very lackluster productivity growth in the United States for quite a while now. And so that kind of makes me optimistic too. I don't know, there wasn't a, we don't know what the policy determinants of this were. There is a little bit of evidence, I should have mentioned, that expanded unemployment insurance is positively associated with this surge. That might have done something. But for the most part, there weren't actually really any policies that were directed at, let's stimulate business entry. Nobody tried to do this. It wasn't a policy objective, as best I could tell. And yet it happened anyways. So I think that's encouraging that, you know, if the economy is moving in the right way, you're going to get the entry that you need, hopefully. So I don't know. I'm optimistic from it. I think it's a good sign, at least.
Thanks, Ryan, for this presentation. Is there anything that you can infer about the people who were starting businesses during the pandemic? I mean, I know that in surveys of entrepreneurs, it's typically not someone wearing a hoodie in their parents' basement on their laptop. It's someone in their 40s who's accumulated some savings, achieved some expertise. Do we know anything about, is there anything about this that breaks with that, or do we just not have the data that allows us to make any inferences there?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. Historically, the successful business entrants tend to be older than people think. They tend to be in their 30s or 40s or something. In this particular episode, we don't know very much yet. We can infer a few things from household surveys. So for example, if you look across race and ethnicity, huge surge among Latino immigrants, so just enormous relative to other groups. So there's a little bit of evidence like that. There's some ongoing research that I'm not doing. My co-author and some census people are working on actually looking specifically at the entrepreneurs in the microdata behind the firewall at Census. And so I think very soon we're gonna know more about them. Certainly we're gonna know much more about their demographics, but also I think soon we'll know about what's their business history. Right now, we're just barely getting the data that we would need to answer that question.
You started your talk by showing this picture of the United States and showing the South had a huge increase in this. And living in Texas, I can tell you there are a huge number of people moving to the South during the pandemic. My house price really appreciates this. Do we know if any of this is driven by people leaving, say more highly regulated states where it's harder to start a business and moving to the less regulated South, where maybe now they feel it's easier to start a business, and that's where some of these applications are coming from?
Yeah, so we don't know. One important point is all the maps that I showed you were measured on a per capita basis. So those maps weren't just driven by these very large population flows you're mentioning. They were actually like above and beyond that, economic activity. Like same with Ryan's question, we don't really know who started these businesses yet. So we don't know where they came from. We could maybe infer something if we looked at the specific migration patterns, but we don't really know where they came from. One early theory that we had was some of those states with the big surge are the states that had the least business restrictions in the pandemic, so those first few months. So an early theory was, well, the states that sort of stayed open, they got the entrance, and that might have been true for a time, but that's another one of those theories that the business restrictions are now years behind us. And so it's hard to explain ongoing surge with that. So these are good questions. We don't really know. The state that, Texas looks pretty good on these maps. The state that looks amazing is Georgia. Georgia, I think, might be the biggest surge state. And we really don't know what's going on there. I think this would be really important for somebody to go figure that out.
I'm curious if you've done any work on kind of capital markets activity in relation to this, and even at the state level, I think that'd be interesting, but just capital market conditions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we haven't, but we've thought about it. So historically, young firms are particularly sensitive to financial conditions. And so there's lots of literature on this. Young firms, and others here probably know much more than I do. Maybe some of you have started firms. Young firms kind of beg, borrow, and steal to get the capital that they need. And we see in the data that they'll borrow against their house, they'll use their personal credit card, they'll try to get a bank loan, but they don't have any earnings history, so they gotta have some collateral and so on. So historically, there has been a very tight relationship there. Early in the pandemic, financial conditions were very accommodative. Interest rates were very low, asset prices were very high, and so that could be another support for this surge. Now, it's not a secret that financial conditions have tightened quite a lot over the last couple of years, and in particular, credit conditions, when we survey banks and say, are you tightening or loosening credit conditions, they've been tightening for quite a while, even aside from very high interest rates. One might have expected that to sort of kill off the pandemic entry boom. Now, some of these measures have cooled off, but the applications have sort of just continued to be very, very high, even while financial conditions have tightened. To me, that's a puzzle. I don't know why that's happening. Now, there is one offsetting factor, which is that asset prices have stayed pretty high. So maybe if people are using their homes as collateral or something, house prices have stayed very high, and maybe they can keep doing that, although it's pretty pricey to do it with current interest rates. So that's another really big outstanding puzzle about this. In the prior recession, the great financial crisis, business entry fell off before the recession started. It fell off before people were talking about GDP and jobs, and it fell off right about the time that house prices peaked and started falling. And so people have generally thought that that kind of thing was important in the prior recession. But in this recession, the theory worked for a while, but now it's getting harder to explain what's going on with financial conditions. I'm just highlighting a million puzzles. I don't have any answers, as you can see, but these are all good questions, so.
Ryan, thank you for that. We look forward to your continued work in this area because it's very important and really interesting. Thanks very much.